Did Sean Payton play his final card during the Broncos bye week? I'm Henry Chisholm from DNVR Broncos, and today we're digging into how the Broncos used Evan Engram during the Sunday night football game against the Commanders and what that could mean for the rest of the season. Evan Engram played his best game of the season on Sunday against the Commanders. He led the team in receiving yards with 79. It was the first time he hit the 50-yard mark in a game for the Broncos. He also had 6 catches, which was the most of anybody on the team and the most that he had all year. So, what changed for Evan Engram in that game? Let's dig into a couple of plays. Here's an example of one of the things the Broncos did with Evan Engram that isn't all that unique for a tight end. They line him up on the end of line of scrimmage. They're in empty. They have Evan chip the defensive end. And then while the rest of the defense floats downfield, there's room for Evan to leak out, catch a pass, take a few more steps after he makes the catch, and provide a decent gain that, is pretty simple, pretty easy, pretty straightforward. It's an easy play. All you do is just chip the defensive end, let Garrett Bowles do the most of the work, and then you leak out and get a few easy yards. This is the type of stuff that you see really good tight ends around the NFL succeed in over and over and over again, but we haven't seen it all that often from the Broncos offense. Let's get into a little bit more challenging play and see what makes Evan Engram special and what could take the Broncos offense to another level. Once again, the Broncos are in empty, and because they're in empty, you create a whole bunch of space in the middle of the field. Now, you see zone coverage here from the Commanders, which means that it isn't a true one-on-one with Bobby Wagner, but by spreading that defense out, it essentially becomes a one-on-one with Bobby Wagner. Evan goes upfield, takes a step to the right, breaks back to the left. That's enough to create separation because he's just a better athlete. And with all that space, he's able to catch the ball and run and turn it into a pretty big gain for the Broncos. This is why Evan Engram is in Denver. Plays like this, and they're plays that we haven't seen all that often. Now, formationally, there's one thing about these two plays that's very similar, and you might be able to guess what it was. I mentioned it. They were in empty both times. Evan Engram this season has been great when the Broncos have gone empty. He's run 215 routes when the Broncos aren't in an empty formation. In other words, somebody joined Bo Nix in the backfield, probably a running back. On those 215 plays without going empty, Evan has a total of 204 receiving yards. That's good for a little bit less than 1 yard per route run. But in the 46 routes that he's run in empty sets, he has 135 yards, or about 3 yards per route run. Essentially, you're getting triple the production when you go empty with Evan Engram. And there's a little bit of a coincidence here too, because Bo Nix thrives in empty formations. He has a 101.5 passer rating when he lines up empty. He has an 81.7 rating when he isn't empty. That's a 20-point difference in his passer rating. All of a sudden, you start to see these two things line up and wonder if you could be unlocking the Broncos passing game by playing Evan Engram in more of these empty sets, allowing Bo to spread the field out, read the defense maybe a little bit easier, and make some plays. The Broncos seem to have something here, and keep these numbers in mind because we're going to go on a bit of a tangent before we circle back. You've probably heard that the NFL is a marathon and not a sprint. It's said all the time on TV, on Twitter, wherever you may be looking. But if you want to get a little bit more nuanced with it, teams evolve over the course of a season. The team that you start with at the beginning of training camp at the end of July isn't the same team that you see in the beginning of February when the Super Bowl's played. Over the course of all these months, some things go well, some things go wrong. Maybe an injury takes away one of a team's strengths. Maybe a young player breaks out and opens up a new part of the playbook. Maybe there's a hot streak in the run game that allows a team to play more play action off of that. Some coaches have the philosophy that a team changes about every 4 weeks, that what you get for one 4-week span is different than what you're going to get from the next 4 weeks because either defenses adjust and force their hand or one of those other situations happens. A young player breaks out. Maybe they find something that starts working for them. Teams are constantly evolving. The key is to make as many of those evolutions positive instead of negative, because the teams that stagnate wind up falling behind, whereas the teams that consistently find ways to improve are the teams that play deep into the season. Let's take a look at last year's Super Bowl champions, for example. They added Saquon Barkley in the offseason, and the Philadelphia Eagles were running the ball pretty well early in the season, but they didn't realize just how well they were running the ball immediately. It's easy to forget at this point, but in your average fantasy draft, Saquon Barkley was picked 10 10.5 last year. You would think, given that he ran for as many yards as he did, carried the team to the Super Bowl, that he would be one of the top 2 or 3 picks in those drafts, but there was some hesitation at the start of the year. Because of that hesitation, the Eagles started the season with a bit of a balanced attack. They were throwing the ball 30 times per game. Actually, in each of the first 4 games of the season, Jalen Hurts threw the ball at least 30 times. And not once did he have a 90 passer rating. So after about 5 games, Nick Sirianni, the head coach, who Eagles fans were calling for his job at the point, decided to turn up the dial a little bit on the run game. He added about 20% more carries to Saquon Barkley's workload in the final stretch of the season compared to what he did in the first 5 games of the season. That's a pretty significant difference, and it worked out. Those first 6 weeks of the season, Saquon averaged 96 rushing yards per game. Over the course of the rest of the season, after they turned that dial up, he averaged 139. That's a massive, massive difference. And it was the reason that the Eagles offense became a high-powered attack. All of a sudden, you no longer were asking Jalen Hurts to throw the ball 30 times per game. He actually only threw the ball 30 times in one more game the rest of the way, including the playoffs. And he only had one more game where he had a sub 90 passer rating. They're able to lead more on Saquon, and that meant that Jalen Hurts' job was a lot easier. He's picking apart one-on-ones. The workload was not nearly as heavy. They kind of solved their offense by evolving over the course of the season. And they made plenty of other changes. One of them on the defensive side, after the bye week, they decided to sub in rookie cornerback Cooper DeJean into the nickel spot. It worked out pretty well. The defense improved almost immediately. And by the end of the year, he was the Super Bowl MVP. These are some very notable changes, but they're the types of little evolutions that NFL teams go through over the course of a season. You could go back through other champions and see the same things. The couple of Super Bowls before that, they were both won by the Chiefs, unfortunately. But one of the changes that they made was they subbed in Rashee Rice for Kadarius Toney. All of a sudden, the passing attack leveled up, and Rashee Rice was a big reason they won the Super Bowl. They subbed in Isaiah Pacheco after he wasn't hardly on the field at all at the beginning of the season before, and he became an important part of a rush game that went on to win the Super Bowl. Before that, you have the Rams, who made maybe the most drastic personnel decisions of any team in the past, decade or so? We'll remember here in Denver that at the trade deadline, they made a move to add Von Miller. They went on to sign Odell Beckham Jr. a few weeks later, who became an important part of the team. They moved Ernest Jones, the linebacker, from a backup spot into a starting role. They moved Jalen Ramsey around the formation, allowing him to be weaponized a little bit instead of just playing as the true boundary cornerback he played on for his entire career up to that point. They added Eric Weddle, the former Pro Bowl safety, right before the playoffs began. Theirs were more personnel changes than they were stylistic, schematic changes, but these changes were really important to their entire journey from the start of the year to the end. Good teams find ways to make these changes. Bad teams stagnate or even make negative changes, lose players, and they can't figure out the answer. But back to the Broncos. Let's take a look through the Broncos season so far at kind of what those changes have been. Remember, we got to go back to the start of training camp. Now, the passing game has been pretty straightforward, I would say. Expectations were pretty high for Bo Nix coming into training camp. Sean Payton said that he thinks he's capable of being a top 4 or 5 quarterback in the NFL. He's ready to do that right now. There was the breakout from Troy Franklin during training camp where he was able to solidify a starting job for himself. But as the season has progressed, maybe a little bit of disappointment from the passing game early on, some early reliance on play action that dried up a bit during the middle portion of the season so far, and has come back, especially in this game against the Commanders. Some more snaps for Pat Bryant, but not too many drastic changes. The run game, though, is where you have seen the changes, mostly with JK Dobbins. Remember during training camp that we weren't sure how the running back carries would be split up. We thought that there could even be a pretty 50-50 split between JK Dobbins and the rookie RJ Harvey. What happened, though, was JK took the majority of that workload, and he grew through the beginning portion of the season. Week 2, he had more rushing yards than week 1. Week 3, he had more rushing yards than week 2. Week 4, he had his first 100-yard game. There was a clear upward trend to the point where we realized that the Broncos might actually have a pretty dominant running game. Now, unfortunately, JK's injured and out for the rest of the season, unless you believe some reports that say he could be back for the Super Bowl if the Broncos make it that far, which would be a massive addition. The question now is, what is the Broncos offense after JK? How do they pivot? And so far in his absence, they haven't been able to find much of a run game. So what if they decide to flip almost entirely over to the passing game? What if they decide that they need to do something that the Chiefs did last year when they made a run to the Super Bowl and almost abandoned the run game? Now, this doesn't mean that you never run the ball, but maybe you get that percentage down to 1 in 3 plays, at least for a stretch, because you know that you have something in the passing game. Not only did Evan Ingram have the best game of his season on Sunday, Bo Nix threw the second most passing yards he's ever thrown in his career. There's a little trend here. And I think that playing the Evan Ingram card by getting him on the field, using him as the Joker that Sean Payton wants him to be, and setting up one-on-ones with various guys in the middle of the field, whether it's a safety or a linebacker, puts Evan in situations where he can succeed. Sean Payton during the bye week had a chance to reevaluate what this offense is. And I think that after the self-scout, he realized that the untapped asset on this offense is Evan Ingram. And so maybe you need to build the offense around him for a stretch. Maybe you need to find a way to get him more one-on-ones, create more space for him in the middle of the field. Maybe you're seeing this trend that he's really good in empty formations and Bo's really good in empty formations, and you could lean more on those sorts of situations moving forward. We'll see if this is how it plays out, but I think it would make a lot of sense because, like I said, he is the untapped asset, and there's a trend of tight ends being particularly good this time of year. We're going to look at some stats now. This is from 2020 to 2024, the last 5 full seasons that we've played in the NFL, and we're going to look at 2 sets of numbers. The first is going to be passer ratings when quarterbacks target certain positions. So when they target the running back, when they target the receiver, when they target the tight end, and how those kind of change and where the value is, essentially. And we're going to narrow this down just to teams that make the playoffs because we're going to look at how teams performed when throwing to these positions in the playoffs in a second. So we want to keep those samples about the same. So teams that went on to make the playoffs in the regular season over the past 5 years have seen pretty much equal efficiency when throwing to a running back, a receiver, or a tight end. There's hardly any change at all. There's maybe a slight bias toward throwing to a tight end, but it's nothing like what you see in the postseason. When you look at the past 5 postseasons, you see that there is nothing more efficient than throwing to a tight end. And this has been a trend that's been going on not just in these 5 years, but for the better part of this century. You know, the past 3 Super Bowl champions, their leading receiver in the playoffs has been a tight end. Now, 2 of those are Travis Kelce in an offense where they lack receivers, so it's not that big of a surprise. But even last year, it wasn't Devontae Smith or A.J. Brown who led the Eagles in receiving yards during the playoffs. It was Dallas Goedert. And you go back to see plenty of examples. Obviously, Gronk being one of them. There's more years of Kelce being the leading receiver. You go back to when our friend Peyton Manning played against Sean Payton in the Super Bowl. It wasn't Marvin Harrison. It wasn't Reggie Wayne who led the Colts in receiving yards that year. It was Dallas Clark. When you go back to when the Broncos won the Super Bowl, their leading receiver was Emmanuel Sanders. Their number 2 wasn't Demaryius Thomas in the postseason. It was Owen Daniels. Tight ends play up in the postseason. And so playing this Evan Ingram card now makes sense. You build it so that by the time the playoffs run around, you have a strength to lean on. And I think there might be one more card that Sean can play. I'm gonna see if you guys can guess what this final card will be. And I'll give you a hint. We don't go a day on the podcast without somebody saying the Broncos need to do this more. I'll add, with JK Dobbins gone, it makes even more sense to lean on this more heavily. The last hint will be, there's a good reason the Broncos haven't been doing this all year and why Sean would wait to play this card until this point in the season or even later. You want Bo Nix to run the ball more because Bo Nix is really good running the ball. And when you go empty, all of a sudden you're spreading out the middle of the field so he's even better running the ball. Just go back and watch the game against the Commanders. Now, you don't want him running all season because you can run a quarterback in the ground. It's a bad idea. There's a reason why last year Bo Nix ended the season while playing with a broken bone in his back. What you'd really like is for him to be healthy, but eventually push comes to shove and you realize that the risk of Bo getting hurt is worth the reward of all those additional yards that he can add on the ground. That's particularly true of a team that doesn't have much of a ground attack without JK Dobbins. So if you add 5 or 6 carries from Bo Nix, once you hit the postseason, all of a sudden the offense could have a little bit different look. I think that that's the final card that Sean Payton has to play. But as for right now, we're playing a different card. It's the Evan Ingram card. You're finding a way to work him into the offense by almost making him the first option, by looking to him and building the passing attack around him from there. It's an interesting idea, and it's an idea that probably makes a bunch of sense by the numbers and knowing that he's one of your most special athletes on offense. Eventually, you wind up playing that final card, which will be giving Bo Nix the green light to run more.
We all silly like the mayor.